First female pastor at NY's famed Riverside Church ousted after allegedly taking ministers to sex shop. New York, the Reverend Amy K. Butler, the first female pastor of New York City's famed Riverside Church who revealed last year that she was sexually harassed at the church, is now being ousted from her post. The pastor is facing allegations that her colleagues felt pressured to follow her to a sex shop during a church conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she gifted a vibrator to one female minister. The progressive Riverside Church, which has hosted iconic political and cultural figures like Martin Luther King Jr., former President Bill Clinton and Nelson Mandela, announced earlier this month that they would not be renewing Butler's contract after 5 years but did not state a reason. Reverend Dr. Amy Butler and the Riverside Church Council are announcing that after 5 years of leadership, Pastor Amy will not be renewing her contract as senior minister. As Pastor Amy's contract has approached its end, both she and our congregational leadership have been prayerfully discerning how best to fulfill the work of God in the world to which they are called, the church said in part. On Thursday, the New York Post published a report alleging that Butler lost her job due to complaints that she took 2 Riverside Church assistant ministers and a female congregant to the Smitten Kitten sex shop in Minneapolis during a trip to the 27th Annual Festival of Homiletics, a week-long conference where the 49-year-old presided over the closing worship service. "We wrapped up our week of powerful sermons with Sink or Swim," a message shared by Amy Butler, senior pastor at the Riverside Church of New York based on excerpts from Genesis 6-9. In the sermon, Butler dug into a text many preachers like to avoid, the story of Noah and the flood. The story of Noah does not appear in full in the lectionary. Maybe because, as Butler put it, the story of Noah and the ark is pretty much a terrible story. The plotline centers around a natural disaster that destroys the whole world, and God is a terrible character in this story, the conference website noted about Butler's work. Butler, a mother of 3, reportedly gifted one of the assistant ministers a $200 vibrator at the sex shop and purchased pleasure toys for herself and a female congregant. A source that spoke with the New York Post alleged that the single mother who was celebrating her 40th birthday when her boss gifted her the vibrator didn't want it. She reportedly accepted the gift because she was afraid. The second minister, a gay man, was also offered a toy but he reportedly declined. Butler allegedly told the uncomfortable ministers that they didn't have to accompany her to the sex shop but they allegedly felt pressured and feared professional retaliation, the source said. It was further alleged that while she was at the register paying for the sex toys, she flashed the church credit card and quipped, "Is this a church business expense?" It was unclear if the items were actually charged to the church. Days after the incident, formal harassment claims were made against Butler and they were allegedly substantiated. The Christian Post reached out to Riverside Church to confirm the allegations but Brian Simpson, the church's director of communications and strategy, said we have no comment and directed this reporter to their earlier statement. "This is pretty much what we have to say on the matter," he said. Butler's supporters said in a report in the New York Times that her ouster is retaliation for speaking out about sexual harassment at the church, specifically regarding an incident involving a former member of the church's governing council who left a bottle of wine and a t-shirt on her desk, both bearing labels that read "Sweet Bitch." There is absolutely no doubt that sexism played a role, the Reverend Kevin Wright, who was recruited by Butler in 2015, told the Times. He had served as executive minister for programs but left in 2018. "I don't understand how anyone could think anything different." Butler's opponents argued in the New York Times report that Butler had been at odds with the deeply traditional culture of the church's governing council for some time. Even though the church supports progressive politics, there were concerns about her spending priorities. She was also pushing for a substantial pay raise to be closer to that of her predecessor. The New York Post reported that Butler's 5-year contract, which expired June 30, paid her a $250,000 annual salary, an $8,000 a month housing allowance and more than $55,000 in yearly pension contributions. Butler's supporters also point to her conflict with the influential former member of the church's governing council, Ed Lowe, as the source of her problems at the church. Lowe, 70, according to the Times, was the one who gave Butler the bottle of wine and t-shirt with the labels that read "Sweet Bitch." An internal investigation, which found that Lowe had violated the church's anti-harassment policy, also revealed that he sent suggestive emails and text messages to Butler's female colleagues. Lowe, a physician, argued in an interview with the Times that the allegations against him stemmed from his criticism of Butler's management style. "It was clearly a put-up job, as far as I'm concerned," he said. "A bully can only ride your back if you bend over, and I stood tall and erect. That irritated her more than anything else." He said he went to coaching to rectify his behavior but celebrated Butler's departure. "When I heard what was going on, I felt redeemed," Lowe told The Times. "I felt my church has been saved. I felt vindicated." 50% of practicing Christians in the United States believe that the history of slavery still has an impact on the country, according to a new report by the Barna Group. In a report released on Tuesday, Barna found that 50% of practicing Christian respondents answered that they mostly or totally believe that the effects of slavery continue to be felt today. This was slightly higher than the general U.S. adult population at 46%. Further, 28% of practicing Christians responded that they mostly or totally agree with the statement that our society has moved past slavery, while 16% responded that they are not sure. Barna found a considerable gap among respondents by race, with 79% of Black Christian respondents saying that the effects of slavery are still felt, versus 42% of white Christian respondents. Further, while 34% of white Christian respondents felt that society had moved past slavery, only 9% of Black Christian respondents agreed. Data for the report came from online surveys of 1,007 U.S. adults and 1,502 practicing American Christians that were completed April 2018 through August 2018. The sample had a margin of error of 2.9%, while the practicing Christian sample had a margin of error of plus or minus 2.3%. Another finding of the report was that millennials were more likely than older generations to believe that slavery still affected modern U.S. society and were the least likely of surveyed generations to have not considered the issue. Millennials appear to be the most sensitive to these conversations, even though they are the farthest removed from the civil rights era. Among practicing Christians, they are the generation most likely to report being aware of effects of slavery on our present-day society, 65% versus 55% of Gen X, 40% of boomers, 41% of elders, noted Barna. Only 2% of millennials haven't considered the impact of slavery on Black Americans today. This could be because, as this and other Barna studies show, millennials, and Gen Z beyond them, are more likely to represent a multi-ethnic community. Barna's report came amid renewed debate in both political and religious circles on whether the modern descendants of American slaves should receive reparations. Carrie Day, Associate Professor of Constructive Theology and African American Religion at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey, recently argued that reparations were biblical. In a lecture last month at the historic Riverside Church in Manhattan, Day used the example of Zacchaeus the tax collector as described in Luke 19. Zacchaeus is a tax collector who has participated in Roman imperial oppression against marginalized Jewish populations. Jesus sits with Zacchaeus but is clearer with Zacchaeus on what his reparative response needed to be and that this reparative response as Zacchaeus was tasked to do was not simply and only a political response but was more deeply a theological response, she explained. In his encounter with Zacchaeus, I want to suggest that Jesus sets forth a reparations ethic. Zacchaeus is expected to give back that which he has stolen so that he can be reconciled with others and God. Reconciliation cannot occur until he has given back what he has stolen. John Carpenter, pastor of Covenant Reformed Baptist Church in Yanceyville, North Carolina, wrote on social media that the call for reparations merely creates social justice contras. Obviously taking money from one group of people, none of whom actually participated in the wrongdoing and many of whom don't have any ancestors who did, to distribute it to others is divisive and sure to inflame racism, tweeted Carpenter in March. This news is brought to you by The Christian Post.